The smell of expensive cologne and old money filled the ballroom of the St. Regis, but all I could smell was the stench of my brother's arrogance. It was my son's christening, a day that should have been about new beginnings, but for my brother, Michael, it was just another stage to perform his favorite play, the great success and the family failure. Arden, honestly, Michael's voice boomed, loud enough to stop the clinking of champagne flutes across the room. You've spent 10 years researching at that university for what? A salary that wouldn't cover the tires on my Porsche? You should have followed me into private equity. At least then you'd be able to afford a suit that wasn't from a clearance rack. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter traveled through the crowd of 50 relatives and business associates. My father, a man who measured worth by the height of a skyscraper, nodded in agreement, his eyes cold. He's right, Arden. You've always been a dreamer, like your grandfather, and we all know where that led him. My grandfather, Silas Sterling, was sitting in the corner, his hands resting on a mahogany cane. He was 89, a retired civil engineer who the family treated like a ghost. For 40 years, my father and Michael had used him as a punchline, the man who threw away the Sterling legacy on a failed shipping venture in the late 70s. Michael leaned in, his face flushed with the certainty of a man who has never been challenged. Tell the boy, Grandpa. Tell him about those valuable shares you're still holding onto. The ones you refused to sell when the company was collapsing. Tell him how it feels to save trash for 4 decades. The room went deathly silent. My grandfather didn't look at Michael. He didn't even flinch at the mockery that had been his daily bread for nearly half a century. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn tweed jacket and pulled out a heavy, wax-sealed envelope. It looked ancient, the edges frayed and the paper yellowed by time. With a trembling hand that had more strength in it than Michael could ever understand, he pressed the envelope into my palm. Arden, he whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. They see the surface of the water. You see the depths. Keep this safe. Do not open it until the moon is full and your mind is clear. Oh, here we go, Michael jeered, grabbing a fresh drink from a passing tray. The secret treasure map. Careful, Arden, don't get your hopes up. It's probably a certificate for a defunct coal mine or a stack of Confederate dollars. The Sterling trash lives on. I looked down at the envelope. It was heavy, heavier than a few sheets of paper should be. My father stepped forward, his hand on Michael's shoulder. Let him have his paper, Michael. It's a fitting inheritance for a man who lives in books. One man leaves a real estate empire, the other leaves an old envelope. It's the natural order of things. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I didn't speak. I had learned from Silas that silence is a fortress. I tucked the envelope into my jacket, right against my heart. I felt the gaze of my family, the pity from my mother, the contempt from my brother, and the cold disappointment from my father. They saw a failed academic receiving a worthless gift. 3 weeks later, Silas Sterling passed away in his sleep. The funeral was a fast, business-like affair. My father and Michael were already talking about selling Silas's modest cottage before the soil had even settled on his grave. They didn't even mention the envelope. To them, it was a closed chapter of a failed life. But that night, sitting in my small study surrounded by the journals and data sets Michael so frequently mocked, I broke the wax seal. Inside was a single, hand-engraved stock certificate for a company called Atlantic Infrastructure and Logistics, dated October 12, 1978. It was for 500 shares. Beneath it was a small, handwritten note in Silas's precise, engineer's script: the world only watches the fire. They never look at what's being forged in the heat. Check the merger of 84, Arden. Then check the split of 99. And then, wait for the call. I pulled my laptop forward, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum in my chest. I typed the company name into an archival database I used for my research, a tool Michael didn't even know existed. What I found in the next 10 minutes didn't just challenge the natural order of the Sterling family. It threatened to dismantle it entirely. My brother thought he was a titan of industry. My father thought he was the master of our legacy. They were about to find out that for 40 years, they had been mocking the wealthiest man in the state. And that man had just handed me the keys to their destruction. The blue light of my computer screen was the only thing illuminating my study as the clock struck 3 a.m. For hours, I had been staring at the name Atlantic Infrastructure and Logistics. To my father and Michael, this was the tombstone of my grandfather's pride, a venture that allegedly sank into the Atlantic along with his retirement savings. But as I navigated the deep web archival databases I used for my academic research, I realized that the death of Atlantic Infrastructure was actually a carefully staged disappearance. I found the first lead in a 1984 digitized copy of the Financial Times. The headline wasn't a death notice, it was a merger. A multinational conglomerate called Global Transit Partners had swallowed Atlantic in a quiet, private stock deal. The conversion rate was 2.5 shares of Global for every 1 share of Atlantic. My pulse quickened. Silas's 500 shares hadn't vanished. They had transformed into 1,250 shares of a company that was, at the time, aggressively acquiring port rights across the eastern seaboard. "Why didn't you say anything, Grandpa?" I whispered to the empty room. I could still hear Michael's voice from the baptism, laughing about the Sterling trash, while Silas sat there with the patience of a mountain. Michael, with his private equity degree, had spent years analyzing spreadsheets, yet he had missed the most basic rule of the long game: value is often hidden in the shadows where the loud people don't think to look. I kept digging. In 1999, just as Silas's note had predicted, Global Transit Partners initiated a massive 4-for-1 stock split following a record-breaking IPO. My calculation was simple, but the result was staggering. 1,250 shares became 5,000. But the trail didn't stop there. In 2012, Global Transit was acquired by Nexus Core Systems, the massive technology and logistics firm that now dominates the global supply chain. The acquisition wasn't just a stock swap, it included a one-time cash dividend of $150 per share to all long-term shareholders. I pulled out a calculator, my hands beginning to sweat. 5,000 shares multiplied by $150 was $750,000 in cash alone, cash that had likely been sitting in an escrow or unclaimed property account, accumulating interest for over a decade. But the real treasure was the Nexus Core stock. The conversion rate in 2012 was 3 shares of Nexus for every 1 share of Global. My grandfather's original 500 shares of trash had ballooned into 15,000 shares of the most powerful logistics company on the planet. I pulled up the current market price for Nexus Core on my trading app. It was trading at $940 per share. The number on the screen didn't feel real. $14.1 million. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the house suddenly feeling heavy. My father was currently stressed about a $2 million loan for his latest real estate development. Michael was constantly bragging about his 6-figure bonuses while driving a car he couldn't actually afford to maintain. They had spent 40 years treating the wealthiest man in the family like a charity case, never once stopping to wonder why a failed man always seemed so at peace. Then, I remembered the second part of Silas's note: wait for the call. As if on cue, my phone vibrated on the desk. It was an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. I hesitated, then swiped to answer. "Is this Arden Sterling?" The voice was professional, cold, and possessed the kind of authority that only comes from handling billions of dollars. "Speaking," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "Mr. Sterling, my name is Eleanor Vance. I am the chief counsel for the shareholder relations division at Nexus Core Systems. We have been monitoring the estate of Silas Sterling for quite some time. We were notified of his passing 3 weeks ago." I held my breath. "Your grandfather was one of our Legacy 5 shareholders, the original investors whose certificates predate our digital records. According to our ledger, he left specific instructions that upon his death, his portfolio was to be transferred exclusively to his grandson, Arden, provided you could produce the original physical certificate." She paused, and I could hear the sound of a heavy file being opened. "Mr. Sterling, there is also the matter of the accumulated dividends and the interest from the 2012 cash payout. Including the current valuation of the 15,000 shares, the total liquidatable value of your account is approximately $16.8 million. However," she continued, her tone turning sharper, "we have just received a formal inquiry from a Mr. Michael Sterling and a Mr. Charles Sterling. They are claiming that Silas was not of sound mind during his final years and are requesting a freeze on all asset transfers until a full estate audit can be performed." A cold smile spread across my face. They didn't even know what the treasure was yet, but their greed had already led them to try and steal it. They thought they were the predators, but they had just walked into a trap Silas had been setting for 40 years. "Ms. Vance," I said, leaning into the microphone, "I have the original certificate, and I have something else my brother and father don't know about. I have a video recording of Silas Sterling recorded 2 days before he died, explaining exactly why he was cutting them out. I didn't actually have a video yet, but I knew exactly where Silas kept his old camcorder, and I knew my grandfather well enough to know he wouldn't leave his final victory to chance." "Excellent," Eleanor replied. "I suggest you retain counsel immediately. Your family isn't just coming for the money, Arden. They are coming for your reputation. Michael Sterling has already informed our office that he believes you coerced a dying old man." I looked at the framed photo of Silas on my desk. The shattered ego was only just beginning. The threat from Eleanor Vance wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. My father and Michael weren't just looking for a piece of the inheritance, they were looking to unmask me as a fraud to protect their own fragile egos. To them, the idea that the failed academic could be the sole heir to a $16.8 million fortune was an impossibility that violated their worldview. I drove drove to Silas's cottage at 5 a.m., the morning fog clinging to the Connecticut trees like a shroud. Michael had already changed the locks on the front door, a move that was as illegal as it was predictable. He wanted to control the narrative, to find any proof that I had manipulated Silas in his final days. But Michael, for all his private equity training, didn't understand that Silas Sterling was an engineer of systems, not just machines. He didn't hide his secrets behind locks. He hid them in plain sight. I didn't use the front door. I went to the shed, moved a loose floorboard Silas had shown me when I was 10, and retrieved the emergency key. Once inside, the house felt heavy with the scent of old tobacco and motor oil. I headed straight for the basement, the engine room, as Silas called it. On his workbench sat an old Sony Handycam from the late 90s, plugged into a modern digital converter. Beside it was a single SD card and a note, "For Arden. The truth is a digital record now. Michael doesn't understand that data is harder to kill than paper." I slotted the card into my laptop. The video file was dated 2 days before the baptism. The frame was filled with Silas's face, sharp, lucid, and possessing a terrifyingly calm clarity. "Hello, Michael." "Hello, Charles," Silas said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I know you're watching this in a lawyer's office, probably red-faced and reaching for your heart medication. You've spent 40 years laughing at my trash. You've spent 40 years calling me a fool while you built your empires on sand and debt." He leaned closer to the lens, his eyes boring into the camera. "I didn't hide my wealth because I was ashamed. I hid it as a filter. I wanted to see who in this family possessed the curiosity to look beneath the surface. Arden was the only one who ever asked me how a machine worked, instead of how much it cost." Silas then held up a stack of medical evaluations, all dated within the last month. "I've been evaluated by 3 independent neurologists. I am of sound mind, and I am explicitly disinheriting both of you. Not because of the mockery, I can handle a joke, but because you are lazy. You saw a falling stock price in 1986 and you stopped thinking. You assumed bankruptcy because it fit your narrative." The video ended with a final, chilling smile. "Arden, the password for the encrypted subledger is the serial number of the first turbine we built together. Use it well. Shatter their certainty." As I closed the laptop, my phone lit up. It was a group text from my mother, but the tone was pure Michael. "Arden, we know you were at the cottage. We have security footage. Dad is filing for an emergency injunction at 9 a.m. He's telling the board at the university that you've embezzled from a dying man's estate. You can end this now by signing over 80% of the shares to the Sterling Trust. Don't be a fool." They weren't just going for the money anymore. They were going for my career. Michael was using his influence to poison my professional reputation before I could even claim my seat at the table. He thought he had me cornered because he had security footage of me entering a house I technically didn't own yet. He was playing checkers, and Silas had already programmed the computer to win at chess. I called Patricia Chun, the estate attorney Marcus Webb had recommended. "Patricia, I have the video. I have the medical clearances. And I have the password to a subledger that likely contains 40 years of tax records proving Silas paid his own way while they called him a charity case." "Good," Patricia replied, her voice sounding like sharpened steel. "Because Michael just leaked a story to the Stamford Gazette. The headline reads, 'Local academic accused of elder abuse in multi-million-dollar estate battle.' They're trying to unmask you, Arden. They want to make you so toxic that no bank will touch you." "Let them publish it," I said, looking at the handycam. "The higher they build their tower of lies, the more it's going to hurt when I pull the foundation out from under them. I want a meeting. Today. My father's office. Tell them I'm ready to negotiate my surrender." I wasn't surrendering. I was walking into the lion's den with a cage. The glass-walled office of Sterling Development sat on the 30th floor, overlooking a city my father, Charles, believed he had built. When I walked in at 10 a.m., the atmosphere was thick with a premature sense of victory. Michael was leaning against my father's mahogany desk, swirling a glass of expensive scotch despite the hour, while their lead attorney, Richard Townsend, adjusted his silk tie with a predatory grin. "Arden, glad you could join us," Michael said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I saw the Stamford Gazette this morning. Rough headline. 'Elder abuse is a hard tag to shake in the academic world.' I imagine the university board is already drafting your suspension." My father didn't look up from his papers. "You brought this on yourself, son. If you had just been honest about the trash Silas gave you, we could have handled this as a family. But you got greedy. You tried to play the mastermind." I sat down in the leather chair opposite them, placing Silas's old handycam on the desk. I remained calm, my silence acting as a mirror to their frantic energy. "I'm here to discuss the Sterling Trust proposal," I said quietly. Townsend slid a document across the desk. "It's simple, Arden. You sign over 80% of the Nexus Core shares to your father and brother. In exchange, we kill the story in the Gazette, withdraw the elder abuse allegations, loans, and let you keep a small consultation fee. It's a generous offer for someone who's about to be unemployed. Michael chuckled. Come on, Arden. You're a researcher. You know the data. You have zero leverage. We have the influence, we have the lawyers, and we have the narrative. You're just a guy with an old envelope. I looked at the document, then back at Michael. You're right about one thing, Michael. I do know the data. For instance, I know that your private equity firm is currently facing a liquidity crisis because you over-leveraged on the New Haven project. You need this inheritance to cover your own tracks. Michael's face went pale, the scotch frozen halfway to his lips. And father, I turned to Charles, who finally looked up. Sterling Developments is currently under investigation for zoning irregularities on the west side. You don't want a public estate battle right now. It invites too many eyes on your own ledgers. How do you? My father started, his voice cracking. I'm a researcher, I reminded him with a thin smile. But I'm not here to talk about your failures. I'm here to show you Silas's final success. I flipped the screen of the handycam and pressed play. The image of Silas Sterling filled the screen, sharp and undeniable. The room went silent as his voice, strong, lucid, and filled with a lifetime of hidden wisdom, echoed off the glass walls. Hello, Michael. Hello, Charles. The video began. I'm recording this because I know your greed is as predictable as the tides. You think Arden coerced me? No. I chose him because he's the only one of you who understands that the real Sterling legacy isn't built on debt, it's built on foresight. I paused the video at the 30-second mark, right as Silas held up his certified medical clearances. That's just 30 seconds, I said, leaning back. In the full 10 minutes, Silas details exactly how he feels about your business acumen. He explains why he spent 40 years letting you mock him, specifically so he could use this moment to unmask the fact that you aren't the titans you pretend to be. Townsend's predatory grin had vanished. He leaned over to whisper to my father, his face tight with concern. If you move forward with the injunction or the elder abuse story, I continued, my voice steady, I will release the full video to the Stamford Gazette, the university board, and every one of your investors. I will also release the subledger Silas kept, a record of every time he quietly bailed out this company over the last 40 years while you called him a charity case. My father's jaw dropped. He bailed us out through an anonymous holding company called Sterling Vision, I said, standing up. He didn't want you to know because he wanted to see if you could ever learn to lead without a safety net. You failed. I picked up the handycam. The offer is off the table. I'm not giving you a cent. In fact, I'm calling in the Sterling Vision loans. You have 48 hours to figure out how to pay back the $4 million Silas gifted your failing projects, or I'll see you in court for the liquidation of Sterling Developments. As I walked toward the door, I heard Michael's glass shatter against the floor. The shattered ego was complete. They had tried to trap the mastermind, but they had only succeeded in unmasking their own ruin. The 48-hour deadline I had set in my father's office hung over the Sterling family like a guillotine blade. While Michael and Charles scrambled to find a way to pay back the $4 million in Sterling Vision loans, I was headed to Washington, D.C. to meet with Eleanor Vance and the Nexus Core board. In my briefcase sat the original 1978 certificate and the SD card containing Silas's final, crushing testimony. The Nexus Core headquarters was a monolith of glass and steel, a temple to the very distributed data my grandfather had predicted in 1978. Eleanor Vance met me in the lobby. She was even more formidable in person, a woman who moved through the corridors of power with the surgical precision of a high-frequency trader. Mr. Sterling, she said, her handshake firm, your brother and father haven't stopped calling. They've moved from legal threats to family concern. Michael even attempted to send a private courier here this morning with a forged power of attorney, claiming you were unreachable due to a mental breakdown. I felt a cold flash of anger, but I didn't let it show. Michael's desperation is a data point, Ms. Vance. It tells us we're close to the end. We entered a high-security vault where a team of forensic document analysts was waiting. They spent 3 hours examining Silas's certificate under ultraviolet lights and high-magnification scanners. They checked the watermark, the ink composition, and the serial numbers against their 1978 ledger. It's genuine, the lead analyst announced, looking up with a hint of awe. This is one of only 3 physical certificates left from the original Atlantic infrastructure merger. Most were lost or discarded during the '86 downturn. Eleanor turned to me. The shares are yours, Arden. The $16.8 million valuation is current as of the opening bell this morning. We are prepared to initiate the transfer to your private account immediately. However, as the majority legacy shareholder, you now have a seat on our logistics oversight board. I want the transfer completed within the hour, I said, and I want the cash dividend from the 2012 payout moved into a separate holding account. I have a specific use for it. As the paperwork was being processed, my phone erupted with a series series of frantic notifications. Michael had gone past the point of no return. He had posted a video to his social media, standing in front of Silas's old cottage, claiming that I had stolen the family heritage and was selling out the Sterling legacy to a faceless corporation. It was a pathetic attempt to use public opinion to pressure me, but he had made a fatal mistake. He was standing in front of a house that now legally belonged to me. I called my father's office, but I didn't ask for him. I asked for the head of security. "This is Arden Sterling. I am the sole owner of the Sterling cottage on Harbor Road. I want Michael Sterling removed for trespassing immediately. And tell my father that the 48-hour window just closed. I'm initiating the recall on the Sterling Vision loans now." 30 minutes later, the transfer was confirmed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a failed academic. I was a man with the financial firepower to rewrite my family's history. But as I walked out of the Nexus Core building, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, revealing Michael's face, red, sweating, and twisted with a level of hatred I had never seen before. "You think you won, Arden?" he spat, his voice trembling. "You think you can just take 40 years of our work? That money belongs to the Sterling Trust. If you don't sign it over by tonight, I'm not just going to the Gazette. I'm going to the police with evidence that you forged Silas's signature on those medical clearances." I looked at him, feeling nothing but a profound sense of pity. He was so blinded by his own certainty that he didn't realize he was already underwater. "Michael," I said, leaning toward the window, "the medical clearances weren't signed by me. They were digitally verified and time-stamped by the hospital's blockchain system. Silas set it up that way because he knew exactly what you would try to do." I tapped the screen of my phone, showing him the notification of the $4 million loan recall. "Sterling Developments is currently being liquidated. You aren't here to threaten me. You're here to beg. And I think we both know how I feel about begging." I walked away as Michael began to scream, a sound of pure, shattered ego that echoed through the DC streets. The drive back from DC felt like a victory lap, but I knew Michael was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are at their most dangerous. He had spent his entire life believing he was the predator, the high-stakes gambler who always held the winning hand. Now that I had unmasked the truth, that his empire was built on the silent charity of the man he mocked, his reality was fracturing. When I arrived at my home, the air felt charged. I checked my security feed. Michael's car had been idling 2 blocks away for an hour. He wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. His ego had completely overtaken his judgment. He believed that if he could just get his hands on that SD card, the ghost in the machine, he could somehow delete the evidence of his own inadequacy. I walked into my study and waited. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the same chair where I had first discovered the $14.1 million secret, the blue light of my monitors casting long shadows against the walls. At 11:15 p.m., the glass in my back door shattered. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for my phone and hit record on the internal security system. I heard Michael's heavy, frantic footsteps in the hallway. He was shouting my name, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and what sounded like genuine panic. "Arden, give it to me," he roared, bursting into the study. He looked like a ghost of the man from the baptism. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was matted with sweat, and his eyes were wild. "I know it's in here. The video, the ledger. Give me the card, and I'll make the liquidation go away. I'll talk to Dad. We can fix this." "It's already fixed, Michael," I said, my voice steady and cold. "The shares are transferred. The Sterling Vision loans have been called. The data is already in the hands of 3 different law firms and the Nexus Core board." Michael lunged at my desk, knocking over a stack of research journals. "You think you're so smart? You're a thief. You've been planning this since you were a kid," whispering in Grandpa's ear while the rest of us were actually working. "I didn't have to whisper, Michael," I said, standing up slowly. "I just had to listen, something you never learned to do. You were too busy listening to the sound of your own voice telling everyone how successful you were while you were drowning in debt." He stopped, breathing hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of my desk. "Dad is going to lose everything, Arden. The New Haven project, the firm, everything. You're destroying your own father to prove a point." "I'm not destroying him," I corrected him. "I'm unmasking him. He chose to build his life on the lie that he was a self-made titan. He chose to believe Grandpa was a failure because it made him feel superior. I'm just showing him the receipts." Before Michael could respond, the front door opened. My father, Charles, walked in. He looked older, smaller, the sharp lines of his face replaced by a look of profound exhaustion. He saw the broken glass, saw Michael's disheveled state, and then he looked at me. "Michael, get out," my father said softly. "Dad, he has the card. We can still." I said get out, my father barked, a flash of his old authority returning. Michael hesitated, looked at me with one last glance of pure venom, and pushed past our father into the night. The room was silent for a long moment. My father sat down in the guest chair, the same one where Silas used to sit it when he visited me to talk about engineering. He showed me the video. Arden, my father said, staring at the floor. Michael didn't want me to see it, but I found it on his laptop. I heard what Silas said about the holding company, about the Sterling Vision loans. He looked up at me, his eyes wet. I spent 40 years telling that story at every dinner party, about the worthless stock, about how my father didn't understand the market. Every time I said it, I felt like I had finally won the argument we started when I was 22. You didn't win, father, I said gently. You just stopped listening to the only man who actually had the answers. I know, he whispered. The firm is gone, isn't it? Sterling Developments is over-leveraged by $12 million beyond what Silas's loans can cover, I said, stating the data plainly. Michael's been hiding the losses for years. He wasn't a titan, Dad. He was a gambler using Grandpa's silent money to stay in the game. My father let out a long, shuddering breath. The shattered ego was complete, but it wasn't a moment of triumph for me. It was a moment of clarity. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said, we see if you're actually a Sterling. We see if you have the courage to start over without the lies. The morning after Michael's breakdown felt like the first day of a new era. The silence in my study was no longer heavy with secrets. It was clean, cleared of the decades of lies that had propped up the Sterling name. My father had stayed the night in the guest room, and when he emerged for breakfast, the transformation was jarring. Without the tailored Italian suit and the mask of certainty, he looked like a man who had finally stopped fighting a war he had already lost. I called Michael's firm this morning, Charles said, staring into his coffee. They've placed him on administrative leave. Apparently, the board found irregularities in the New Haven accounts that even Silas's silent loans couldn't hide. He's facing a full forensic audit. I nodded, my mind already processing the data. Michael wasn't just gambling with the family name, Dad. He was cooking the books. He thought that because he was a Sterling, the rules of gravity didn't apply to him. He's my son, Arden, Charles whispered, his voice cracking. But looking at that video of my father, hearing him describe how he watched us fail from the sidelines, I realized I've spent 40 years raising a man just like the version of myself I hated. I set my laptop on the table, the screen displaying the finalized liquidation schedule for Sterling Developments. The firm is unsalvageable in its current state, Dad. The debt-to-equity ratio is a disaster, and Michael's legal troubles are going to pull every investor into the mud. If you try to save it, you'll lose everything, including Silas's cottage and your own retirement. Charles looked at the numbers, the shattered ego visible in the way he slumped in his chair. For 40 years, he had defined himself by the growth of this company, mocking the man who had actually built the foundation he stood on. But I have a proposal, I said, leaning forward. I've used a portion of the Nexus Core dividends to create a new entity, Sterling Legacy Engineering. I'm buying the physical assets of your company, the equipment, the patents, and the remaining contracts, out of the liquidation. I'm not saving the brand, but I'm saving the work. My father's eyes widened. You're starting a new firm? Not me, I corrected him. I'm a researcher and an investor. I'm putting you in as a consultant. You won't have the title of president. You won't have a corner office. You'll be in the field, making sure the engineering is sound, the way Silas taught you before you decided you were too big for the dirt. It was a path to redemption, but it was also a test. I was offering him a chance to be the man Silas wanted him to be, but he would have to do it without the ego. While my father considered the offer, the front door bell rang. It wasn't Michael. It was Patricia Chun and two men in dark suits. Arden, Patricia said, her expression grave. We have a problem. Michael didn't go home last night. He went back to the cottage. He tried to burn it down. My heart skipped a beat. The cottage is Silas's basement. The fire department got there in time. One of the men, a detective from the state police, interjected. The damage is mostly to the living room. But Michael didn't run. We found him sitting on the porch, holding a gasoline can and a stack of old shipping records he'd pulled from the walls. He was screaming that the ghost was lying to him. Michael had finally snapped. The unmasking of his own failure was too much for his mind to process. He couldn't destroy the data, so he tried to destroy the history. As they led my father away to give a statement, Patricia pulled me aside. The police found something in the debris, Arden. In the walls of the cottage, Silas had hidden a series of ledgers. They aren't just financial records. They're proof that Michael was siphoning money from the Sterling Vision loans directly into offshore accounts for the last 5 years. I looked out the window at the morning sun. Silas had known everything. He hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a trap for the one person he knew would try to destroy the family from within. The trash wasn't just money. It was the ultimate shattered ego for Michael, a prison sentence built out of the very secrets he thought he was keeping. The fluorescent lights of the visitation room hummed with a sterile, unforgiving vibration. On the other side of the reinforced glass, Michael looked like a man who had finally been hollowed out. The expensive silk suit was gone, replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow him whole. His certainty, the arrogance that had been his armor for 40 years, had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the raw, trembling nerves of a man who realized he had been the architect of his own ruin. "You look different, Michael," I said, my voice echoing in the small chamber. He didn't look up. His hands, once used to dismiss our grandfather with a wave, were locked in a tight, white-knuckled grip on the table. "I saw the ledgers, Arden. The police showed them to me. Grandpa didn't just track the stocks. He tracked me. He was an engineer, Michael," I reminded him quietly. "He understood that if a system is failing, you don't just look at the machine. You look at the person running it. He watched you drain those Sterling Vision loans for 5 years. He didn't stop you because he wanted to see if you had a bottom. You didn't." Michael finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a frantic, desperate hatred. "He set me up. He sat there at every dinner, every holiday, letting me talk, letting me think I was winning, while he was documenting my every move. That's not a grandfather, Arden. That's a predator." "No," I said, leaning closer to the glass. "That's a mirror. He didn't make you steal that money. He didn't make you cook the books at your firm. He just provided the resources and waited to see who you actually were. You unmasked yourself, Michael. He just made sure there was a record of it." I pushed a single piece of paper against the glass, a copy of the first contract signed by Sterling Legacy Engineering. "Dad is back in the field," I said. "He's working as a site inspector in New Haven. He's living in a 2-bedroom apartment near the shore. He told me yesterday it's the first time in 30 years he hasn't woken up with a knot in his stomach. He's not a titan anymore. He's just an engineer. And for the first time, he's actually proud of it." Michael let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "A site inspector? He's pathetic. You're all pathetic. You're sitting on $16 million and you're playing at Legacy. The money isn't the point, Michael. It never was. That's why you lost." I stood up to leave. The guard stepped forward, but I paused for one last word. Silas left a final entry in the ledger, dated the day of the baptism. It said, "Michael has the fire, but Arden has the eyes. One will burn the house down trying to stay warm, the other will rebuild it from the ashes. You proved him right, brother. Enjoy the heat." As I walked out of the facility, the crisp autumn air of Connecticut hit me with a sense of profound relief. The legal battle was winding down. Michael had accepted a plea deal, 7 years for embezzlement and arson. My father was finally at peace with the memory of the man he had spent a lifetime mocking. I drove back to the cottage on Harbor Road. The scorch marks on the porch were gone, replaced by fresh cedar. I walked into the basement, the engine room, and sat at Silas's workbench. I picked up the old mahogany cane that had rested in the corner during the baptism. I realized then that the $13.7 million, which had grown to over $17 million with the latest market surge, wasn't the true inheritance. The money was just the fuel. The real gift was the clarity. Silas had given me the permission to be exactly who I was, a man who looks beneath the surface, who values data over status, and who understands that the loudest voice in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. I opened my laptop and looked at the screen. The Nexus Core shares were holding steady, a silent fortune built on 40 years of patience. I hit a key, authorizing the final transfer for the Silas Sterling Technical Institute, a vocational school for young engineers in Bridgeport, funded entirely by the dividends Michael had called trash. The shattered ego of the Sterling family was finally healed, not by wealth, but by the truth. My father had been wrong. Michael had been wrong. And the quiet man in the tweed jacket had been the smartest person any of us had ever known. I looked at the framed certificate of Atlantic Infrastructure and Logistics hanging on the wall above the workbench. 200 shares. March 14, 1979. I smiled, a quiet, certain smile that I realized was a perfect reflection of my grandfather's. "The future isn't evenly distributed, Silas," I whispered to the empty room. "But it eventually finds its way to the ones who are waiting for it." I closed the laptop, turned off the lights, and walked out into the twilight, leaving the ghosts behind. For the first time in 40 years, the Sterling name didn't stand for a lie. It stood for the truth. And in the end, that was the only currency that mattered.